So, Jane Austen wrote 6 of the most romantic novels ever written. But did she have a love story of her own? What was Jane Austen's love life like? Well, that's what we're going to be going into here in today's video about Jane Austen's love life. We're going to be talking about Tom Lefroy, which of course is the famous romance depicted in the biopic Becoming Jane, about Jane Austen's life. We're going to be talking a little bit about Becoming Jane because I have feelings about it. And we're also going to be addressing something that's arisen in Jane Austen mythology, that she stayed single to be a writer. Is that actually true? Well, in today's video, we're diving into all of it, so definitely stay tuned for that. So first up, let's talk a little bit about the movie Becoming Jane. So Becoming Jane is a biopic of Jane Austen's life. It's starring Anne Hathaway as Jane Austen, and it stars James McAvoy as Tom Lefroy, her Irish romantic love interest that she almost elopes with. Becoming Jane is an interesting movie. I would have to say its historical rating of accuracy when it comes to Jane Austen's life is very, very low. They took so much creative license with everything in the movie. It's definitely an interpretation of her books, I would say. They tried to force as much of Jane Austen's books into her life as they possibly could. They're very clearly modeling, for example, her mother off of Mrs. Bennet. They're modeling the unwanted suitor off of Mr. Collins. They constantly have characters spouting off word for word Austen quotes. And one of the things I don't like about this is because it's essentially intimating that Jane Austen's books were based on her life and people she knew. As in, her characters were not designed by her amazing imagination. These quotes were not written by her literary genius. Rather, she just walked around, copied complete characters from life, and took the words out of their mouth and wrote them down on paper. In real life, Jane Austen actually had an acquaintance who did this. He would write novels about his neighbors to the point where everyone knew exactly who he was talking about, and Jane Austen did not look with a friendly eye on that, and yet that's exactly what they have her doing in Becoming Jane. Another thing Becoming Jane got terribly wrong was her cousin Eliza's entire personality and way of existing in life, which I did a whole video on her cousin Eliza's very dramaful life that you should check out if you want to hear all the Georgian drama. Guys, there's balls, there's beheadings. Anyway, let's talk about the main plot line of Becoming Jane, and more importantly, the historical reality or historical unreality behind it, which is her romance with Tom Lefroy. So in the movie Becoming Jane, we have her meet this young law student, Tom Lefroy. He's coming from the big city. He's forced out into the countryside because he just runs wild and is hanging out with prostitutes, getting in bar fights. Right, this guy is trouble. He comes out and he sees Jane. They fall in love and they almost elope together. So there's that. We have a Lydia Bennet moment going down in Austen's life. Of course, they can't have them elope together in the end because, well, we all know Jane Austen never got married. I guess that was just the one historical fact they didn't feel like they could completely break, even though they could break all the other ones. Who knows what they were thinking in making this movie. Anyway, let's talk about what actually happened with Tom Lefroy. And to talk about Tom Lefroy, we have to talk about Jane Austen's letters. So Jane Austen wrote a lot of letters in her life to her sister and to other people. Jane and her sister Cassandra were best friends forever. They spent their whole life more or less living together as part of the family circle. They shared a bedroom. Whenever they were separated, because one of them was off visiting other relatives, they constantly wrote letters to each other. Letter writing in the Regency era was a major female occupation. They were writing letters practically every day to someone, at least. And in the case where you were separated from a very close family member, in this case, her sister, or for example, a married couple who was separated, they would often write letters every single day, or at least write part of a letter every single day. Which means over Jane Austen's lifetime, she must have written an incredible volume of letters. But we only have access to a very limited number of those because after she died, her sister Cassandra went through and got rid of a lot of her sister Jane's letters. Now, what was Cassandra's motivation for doing this? Well, we can't really be sure, but of course there's the thought that she wanted to protect her sister's memory, and letters are incredibly personal. It's sort of like someone opening up your diary and reading it. I don't think anyone could fault Cassandra for trying to be protective of her best friend and sister Jane. However, this destruction of the letters and a general lack of other major sort of diary or anything Jane Austen would have kept is the fact that we have spotty information when it comes to Jane Austen's life, and more importantly on this topic, her love life. And yet, if you line up Jane Austen's letters chronologically, some of the first letters we have available come from when she is in her early 20s, and they speak of a young man named Tom Lefroy. So it is December, the same month Jane Austen was born in, so she's turning 20 years old actually, and she has this good friend who's one of her neighbors. And this good friend's very cute nephew has come to visit. He's a law student, he's Irish, and Jane likes him. What exactly was this Tom Lefroy fellow like? For one thing, he was absolutely nothing like Tom Lefroy in the movie Becoming Jane. Tom Lefroy has an extreme work ethic, and according to his tutor at college, no young man has left our college with a higher character. He really has the intelligence and work ethic that eventually later in his life leads him to become the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Jane Austen describes him as a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you. He also has blondish hair, which is interesting because Jane Austen preferred blondes. Family tradition has it that Jane Austen actually went after Tom. He was rather shy, and she was rather in search for a husband. Her sister Cassandra was engaged at this point in life, and Jane was very anxious to follow her into this matrimonial state. And Tom was cute, he was smart, he was, kind of in the neighborhood. She needed to catch this guy. Exactly how did Tom Lefroy respond to Jane Austen hitting on him? Well, he got super embarrassed, and when she would come over to visit his aunt, he would hide because his family would tease him about her, right? That's the type of guy he was. He couldn't handle being teased by his family about a girl. However, despite his shyness around her, they definitely hit it off mutually. In fact, Jane Austen describes one of their rendezvous at a ball like this to her sister Cassandra. "You scold me so much in the nice long letter which I have this moment received from you, that I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most prolificate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. I can expose myself, however, only once more, because he leaves the country soon after next Friday, on which day we are to have a dance at Ashe after all." So here we see her describing their behavior together at a ball. They were shockingly dancing and sitting down together. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, generally, you could only dance with a young man twice at a ball unless you wanted to be very shocking, because it was showing decided preference, and you'd better be engaged if you want that to be acceptable behavior. And of course, sitting down together is a young gentleman would sit down next to a lady, either when they're taking some refreshments or just because she doesn't feel like dancing this dance. He'd be like, "I'm going to sit by you and enjoy your company." So was Jane Austen actually breaking the code of etiquette? Of course, we can't be sure. She does not specify how many times they are dancing, but does seem to indicate that she's paying enough attention to him and he's paying enough attention to her to make some gossip happen. The fact that this young couple is showing so much interest in each other that it's apparent to both of their families is definitely raising at least some red flags on his side of the family at this point. Why? Because Tom Lefroy is not currently in a situation to be able to marry. He doesn't have that financial background. He really does have a family back in Ireland that needs him to make it big when it comes to his law profession, and Jane Austen does not have the money or connections to help him towards those aims. They are not a good financial or social match for each other. With that being said, though, this does not stop Jane Austen's feelings of romance towards him, and as they head into the last ball that she'll see him at, here's what she has to say about her expectations to Cassandra. I rather expect to receive an offer from my friend in the course of the evening. I shall refuse him, however, unless he promises to give away his white coat. So by an offer, she means an offer of marriage. However, she seems to be talking in a very joking fashion about it. She's saying like, I don't like his white coat, so I won't say yes unless he agrees to give it away. I mean to confine myself in the future to Mr. Tom Lefroy, for whom I do not care sixpence. So here again, she's joking about how she's going to confine herself to this guy, but she doesn't really care about him. And I think that's something interesting that's coming through in how she writes about him is she clearly likes him, but she also, again, clearly knows that he's not a realistic possibility for her. Then she says on the day of this last ball, "At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy. And when you receive this letter, it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea." So is Jane Austen actually crying over the fact that this is the last day they'll flirt together? I think probably. This is just my interpretation. She's obviously saying that to be funny, as Jane Austen is generally a hilarious comedic writer, whether in her novels or in her letters, but she does seem to have had serious feelings for this guy in their very short acquaintance while he's visiting, and they are flirting and they're sitting down together. And I think in Jane Austen studies, this has always been something highly debated, which is just how emotionally entangled Jane was with Tom. And really, according to family tradition coming down his side of the story, he got sent back to London on purpose in order to stop what his family saw was a growing attachment between him and Jane. His aunt was possibly worrying about Jane falling even more in love with Tom and getting her heart broken even more when he eventually had to leave later. Or she could have been worried about them entering into a secret engagement, sort of like Edward Ferrars and Lucy Steele in Sense and Sensibility. Years later, when Tom Lefroy was an old man and Jane Austen's works were famous, his nephew asked him if he had ever really been in love with Jane Austen, and he admitted that he had, but he called it a boyish love. That phrase, boyish love, is of course debated again as to what it means. Does he mean boyish love as in fleeting infatuation, or does he mean boyish love as in how sometimes young romance is so much more intense than anything you could have possibly later in life? Whatever the case, this young couple clearly had feelings for each other. They were separated by his family because, again, he was not in a position financially or socially to be able to marry her, and they went their separate ways. He goes on to have a stellar career in the law. He becomes the Lord Chief Justice of Ireland, and he gets married. He has children. Now, something else that comes up in this equation is the fact that he names his first daughter Jane. So some people have interpreted this as him having named his first daughter after his long-lost true love, Jane Austen, which, first of all, would that not be the greatest insult to his wife? Imagine your husband being like, I want to name our first kid after my ex-girlfriend. Let's hope that Tom Lefroy was not that dumb of a husband. Also, more importantly, like if you've seen my video on Regency era baby naming, children were very commonly named after their grandparents, and Jane's maternal grandmother was named Jane. Thereby, that is probably where she actually got her name, not her dad naming her after his ex-girlfriend. Meanwhile, Jane is left there in the country. She thinks about him even years later, wondering what he's up to. And Jane Austen never gets married. She has the possibility to. There were different gentlemen that showed interest in that way in her that she generally did not reciprocate. The most famous later episode of this was with a man called Harris Bigg-Wither. Jane Austen would have been about 26 years old when Mr. Harris Bigg-Wither proposed to her. What was this guy like? Well, he was, first of all, her very good friend's younger brother. He was very shy. He had a problem with stuttering. He was known to have a temper. However, he also had the ability to provide her with a very nice home, a very nice lifestyle. She would have been a wife of a member of the landed gentry. This would have moved her up the social hierarchy. It would have been wonderful for her family, for her to marry him. So she's there visiting at his house because, again, she's BFFs with his sisters, and he proposes. You know, there's some assumption that his sisters put him up to this because, you know, when you have a good friend, you're like, hey, how can we be relatives? You should marry my brother, right? So they're having those thoughts. He proposes and Jane Austen accepts him. But she can't sleep that night because she knows it was wrong. And in the morning she goes and she tells him, you know what, I'm sorry, I can't marry you. This was a big deal. It caused uneasy feelings between their families for a long time. She sort of avoids him for a while. Obviously, accepting a guy's proposal and then dumping him the next morning is kind of dramaful. Now, we don't have exact reasons on why she did this. We don't know why she accepted him. We don't know why she canceled her acceptance. But one thing we do know is what Jane Austen later wrote to her niece on the topic of marriage. She says, anything is to be preferred or endured rather than marrying without affection. So if you've seen my video on Does Elizabeth Really Love Darcy, then you know affection is another synonym for love. And she's basically saying anything, even enduring being an old maid that is dependent on the financial assistance of her brothers, is better than being in a marriage where she doesn't love her husband. And I honestly think that's why she turned down Harris Bigg-Wither. I personally feel like that's why she never got married. She never found a man where the circumstances of finances and social connections coincided with her actually liking him. So then this takes us down to this question of, did Jane Austen not get married because she didn't think it would allow her to write? I feel like this is an idea that's very popular in Jane Austen lore, that she was just so dedicated to writing, and if she had gotten married, she wouldn't be able to write because she'd be busy taking care of her household and having kids, and she just didn't want that, and that's why she turned guys down. She was like, no, I have no time for you. I got books to write. Is that actually realistic though? And I feel like, personally, it's not for at least two different reasons. For the first idea is that it was impossible to be a wife and a mother and also a writer during the time period. And that's just not true, especially when we look at the social class that the writers belong to. Writing was a rich people's sport. Rich people wrote books for other rich people. It was definitely, you had to be from the upper middle class, the upper class, to break into being a novelist. Now, when you are part of that class and you are a married woman, first of all, you have servants. And yes, you will likely have children because a general lack of usage of birth control at the time. But you will have servants that will help you take care of those children. And those combined factors is why there were a lot of women writers who were married. Of course, a great example being Anne Radcliffe, the author of The Mysteries of Udolpho. Frances Burney, later in her life, got married, and some of her major works were written after her marriage and becoming a mother. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Charlotte Bronte got married later in her life, though that was obviously after Jane Eyre was written. But overall, there was nothing incompatible about being a mother and wife with being an author. If anything, in some ways, it could help. Married women had higher social standing. They had their own households. They were not an unmarried woman who was constantly being dragged around to visit relatives and have calls on her time that way. Basically, if Jane Austen had married Harris Bigg-Wither with his very nice income, she would have had the help needed at home to be able to write. And she would have been in the country, and she loved writing the most in the country as opposed to the city. The second aspect of this argument, I think, is the idea that Jane Austen was so dedicated to her craft that she was a writer first and a woman second, that she would put writing ahead of true love if she found it. And I just personally think that comes from this over focus on one aspect of who Jane Austen was as a person. Yes, she was a writer. She's like a literary genius that has established so much of what a novel is or should be in the English world. Totally on board with that. But the thing is she was also a human being, and she clearly had a very decided interest when it came to love and romance. Some people, I feel like, think that she wrote about love and romance because she had nothing else to write about, or it was required of the social time. But when I read her books, I see her really delving into the workings of the human heart, what is a good basis for marriage, the foundation of love. She seemed actually interested in how romance worked, and thereby I don't see her as some unromantic that if she had met the right guy would be like, you know what, I just love the books more than you. No marriage for you. Like, especially because if he had been of, again, the right social class, she would have been able to continue to write. Which, speaking again of Jane Austen not finding the right one, we don't know how many times she may have thought that she almost did, because Cassandra destroyed so many of the letters and there's such big holes in our understanding of Jane Austen's life. I'm not saying that there were all these hidden, secret, almost romances in Jane's life, but there could be, and we would never know about it. So what was Jane Austen's love life like? Well, we know that when she was 20 years old, she had a flirtation with Tom Lefroy, which ended with probably her in tears, and him going on to become Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Meanwhile, we don't have a complete picture of the rest of her love life, but we also know that she accepted and then rejected a Mr. Harris Bigg-Wither, who was just not the one for her. So let me know in the comments down below, do you think Jane Austen should have eloped with Tom Lefroy like they have her attempt to in Becoming Jane? Or do you think that she should have married Harris Bigg-Wither for his money and been like, who needs affection in marriage? Let me know in the comments below. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe and keep having an awesome day because you're awesome. Bye!